if everything is up and to the right, and we had up and to the right growth for 18 years straight, if everything's up and to the right, you stop questioning things that you actually should be questioning. Because the growth was slowing like this, but we'd never had a year that we hadn't grown. So we're like, well, of course we're going to come out of it. Of course we're going to come out of it. Surely we're going to come out of it. But then we're not asking the right questions. And then we get to the side where it's like, I don't think we're coming out of this. And then you start to question everything and everyone. And I think a mistake we made there is we started changing too many things at once. So we didn't know what change was working and what change was working against us.
Welcome to the No One Ever Told Me podcast, where we talk about the things that no one ever tells you that you really need to know to be successful and to thrive in business and in your leadership. Today, my guest is Tim Stevens. Tim is a gifted leader with a celebrated career in for-profit and nonprofit sectors and is an author of 7 books. Right now, Tim's newest and current assignment is to lead at Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago, Illinois as the executive pastor. Today, Tim talks about leading through challenging seasons, discerning momentum, and why an inner circle is crucial to leaders. Tim, thanks so much for jumping on the show today. We really appreciate it. You've held senior leadership roles in nonprofits, in churches, and in some for-profit organizations. Would you mind just telling us your leadership journey and how you ended up where you are right now?
Yeah, I would be glad to. So thanks for inviting me to this conversation. So I started having, I don't know how far back you want me to go, but started having in like middle school, probably even late elementary, people start to kind of call leadership out of me and begin to call me or notice leadership in me. And so whether it was, student senate or, captains of teams, those kinds of things, like that just kind of like started to happen. I was in a pretty small school, 30 people in my class.
Wow.
So maybe it was that there just weren't enough to choose from. And so I was picked, I don't know. But then as I, began thinking about like, what am I going to do with my life? I just wasn't quite sure yet. So I joined this organization right out of high school, and I thought I'll do this for a year. And it was kind of it was a nonprofit organization that worked largely with churches. And so I got a chance to work, to travel all around the country, working with different churches and organizations, and like just kept getting tapped for leadership. And so they said, hey, would you stay a second year before you go off to college? I said, sure. And then by the end of that second year, I was being asked to lead a whole team. And so at that point, I just thought, okay, I'm kind of wired as a learner. I had some mentors in my life that said, as I'm kind of like struggling with, do I go to college, kind of stop, because I was kind of on a career path at that point at 19, 20 years old, or do I keep doing what I'm doing? And they said, people that knew me well said, Tim, you're wired as a learner. Not everyone is. You don't need a classroom for that. Nothing wrong with classrooms, but just keep learning and keep moving. So at that point, I just decided to kind of stick at what I was doing. I spent 9 years with that organization, met my wife there.
Okay.
Got to ultimately lead at the national level with that organization, and just grow my leadership. Took some college classes, just some things I didn't know, like understanding financial statements. Things like that I just needed tools in my tool belt. And then got tapped to join this startup. If you're in the church world, we call them church plants, but this was a church that was just getting started in South Bend, Indiana, which, isn't on most people's radar unless they watch football, right. But a little tiny bedroom community outside of South Bend, a church that was meeting in a movie theater that was surrounded by cornfields. And got to jump in at the ground level there. We had maybe a couple hundred people attending at the time. And stayed there for 20 years. The title was executive pastor, grew my leadership there. We grew to about 6,500 people, which that town had never seen anything even close to that as far as church goes. And so it was really cool to see the story that was being written there. And then transitioned to an organization called Vanderbloemen Search Group. So this is a group that's based in Houston, and this is a for-profit business that serves the nonprofit sector and helps find staff. And so I had just kind of honed my gifting, I guess, at hiring and spotting talent. And so they invited me to come down to Houston. I moved my family there. and became the vice president of consulting and led a team that worked with organizations all over the country and outside our borders as well, helping people find staff.
Wow.
And then surprising to me, I figured I'd stay there for the next 10 years until I was ready to transition into kind of shifting down a little bit in my career. Then God tapped my shoulder, and we can unpack that a bit if you want, but to join one of the organizations I was working with, a church called Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago, and I'd helped them find their senior pastor, their senior leader. And that senior pastor turned around and said, "Hey, would you do this with me?"
Wow.
Just a day after he was invited to that role. And so prayed about that. That was the beginning of COVID last April when I made that decision, and joined the team in May.
Holy cow. That like prompts dozens and dozens of questions for me. One of those is, I actually had written this down, like, how did you know you were a leader? And you kind of answered that by like default, people were putting you in leadership roles. Can you remember any qualities or characteristics about the way you presented yourself, or competency or confidence that led to those opportunities? And then how did you maximize on maybe some of those innate gifts, and how'd you grow those gifts?
Yeah, I mean, I think people calling it out of me or saying, "I see this in you," and I can think of specific, I can see faces, a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, a youth pastor, a mentor. I think that was probably the thing, because I don't know that I really thought much about leadership at the time. You're just growing up, you're a kid, right? Yeah. But then I just kept, things where like the classroom would decide or pick, and they would never pick me for sports teams. I was horrible. If we're out in the playground, picking teams for dodgeball, I'm not going to get picked. But for leadership things, they would continue to say, "Hey, let's have Tim lead this." And in high school, I had a history teacher. Her name was Linda Wessel, and Linda just kind of took me under her wing, and she was kind of the teacher sponsor for the student senate. And she took me under her wing, and she just like taught me leadership and like stuff that, performance improvement plans and how to make agendas and things like that a high school kid's not normally thinking about. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was pretty cool. And then I got the chance to, when I mentioned go to this nonprofit, this was right out of high school. So they were recruiting during my senior year. They were going after, I was told later, they were going after my sister. They wanted her to join the organization, and they weren't going after me. But my sister didn't apply, and I did. So they hired me. I was the sound technician for one of the teams. So, I mean, this was like lowest rung on the ladder. You're going to come and you're going to set up, you're going to be a roadie, set up sound and run sound force.
Okay.
And about 3 months in, they said, "Hey, would you be the manager of this team, the co-team manager?"
Okay.
And then towards the end of that year, "Hey, would you direct a team?" So just God continued to use people in my life and just opportunities, really.
Oh, I love that. The other thing that initial setup just kind of prompted in me is like a 9-year term and then a 20-year term in 2 different roles. That's hard to come by in today's culture. So maybe would you speak to longevity and what it looks like to put in a long season at an organization? What are some lessons that you picked up and just staying power? Because that's pretty rare these days, and I think that's pretty impressive.
I don't think I ever thought about career path until I was in my 40s. So
Okay.
I started that organization, and by the time I ended that second year, when I said, "Okay, like I've made a decision, I'm going to stick at this and not go to college," in my mind, I'm doing this for life. And then circumstances and opportunities, it's like I get this opportunity to join this startup church, and I went into that thinking, "Okay, I'm going to do this for life." And I did it for 20 years. And then when I moved to Houston and joined Vanderbloom, and I thought, "Okay, I'm going to do this until I'm ready to stop working full time. So I'll probably do this." I went down there when I was 47. So I thought I'll probably do this for 15 years, and was there for 6 years. So I think that's a piece. And like coming now to Willow, I don't think I have another chapter after this, except for kind of downshifting and doing maybe more what I want to do versus working full time for an organization. So I think I'm here for, 10, 12 years. I don't know what that'll be. So I think that's part of it, is just like, I've never thought of it as like, this is my step to the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's always been the step, the plan.
Right. So that's a mindset shift of this is not, like you said, a stepping stone to what I really want. If you take opportunities thinking that they're stepping stones, you'll treat them like stepping stones. And you're like, no, this is a calling to this opportunity, and I'm going to be committed here until this chapter closes. No, that's great. I love that. So the new role, I mean, it'll take me a second to ask this question, but you're stepping into a situation where there's senior leader transition, and then so there's some crisis just innately in an organization when there's transition. I work in an organization, we had some similar stories in our history. And then just probably on the heels of that, you had the crisis of the pandemic that led to social crisis in the United States. If I'm not careful, I'll let this season define leadership for me, that all leadership is crisis leadership. So maybe unpack what it's like to lead in, because some organizations just had COVID to navigate. You had several fires to attend to. What are you learning about crisis leadership? And then how do you turn the page away from that to vision casting towards what's next in leadership?
No, that's a great question. So coming into this organization, I didn't have a lot of surprises. Now, COVID was a surprise. None of us knew it was going to last as long as it did. And the racial tension that began last summer was a surprise that impacted our team pretty deeply. But apart from that, since I had worked with the organization for a year as a consultant in helping them find their senior leader, like they told me all the stuff. So like there were, I knew about all of I knew what was under every rock. Okay. And the church had come through a pretty difficult season where things were not up and to the right. They were down. Pretty much every metric had been decreasing for 3 years. So that was kind of coming into the early 2020. And then also interim leadership, a void. Most of the 24 out of 25 of our highest level executive leaders in the organization had left in a 3-year period. Wow. And so a lot of overstaffed across the board, but a vacuum at the leadership level. And so that challenge was there, financial challenges as well. And then COVID. And, when we started, when Dave said, hey, you want to do this with me? Dave Dunnett is our senior pastor. It's the first week of April. It's before Easter. And we're thinking we're going to be back meeting in person by May. For sure. Right. June at the latest, and then it was a full over 365 days before that happened. So walking into an organization where you're that's in pain, that's in crisis, and you're trying to build relationships because you need relational equity to be able to kind of lead through that. And you're building relationships like this through screens and lots of Zoom calls. And it was months and months and months before we actually met our staff in person, and months past that before we met very many people in the congregation, as they didn't start meeting until early 2021. But I would say there's a little bit of that challenge that is what drew me to the role. Okay. Honestly, I wouldn't look back and say in my role at the search firm that I was bored. I didn't think that at the time for sure, but I think there was a little bit of the challenge. There's a little bit of just who's going to rise up and help this organization that has 40 plus years of amazing legacy that's gone through a really tough time. Who's going to step up and help kind of rebuild that team and rebuild that dream and rebuild, kind of figure out what the next chapter is. Wow. You said something really interesting in our email exchange about stopping negative momentum, I think is how you said it. When you're evaluating momentum, what are your thoughts about, slowing down things that are impacting progress? And then how do you change that mindset to how do we turn the flywheel, the Jim Collins, momentum flywheel towards positive progress? Yeah. What was interesting, and I'm still figuring this out, this is the first organization I've worked at that has the history. So lots of, 40 plus years of history. Both Vanderbilt and then the church I was at, it's kind of ground floor and kind of build it as you go. Not a lot of, more startup. And so, man, it takes a whole different set of tools and skills. And that's why I just take in the learning as much as I can, learning from others that have done this before. But I would say when we came in, there was a lot of negative momentum as far as all the metrics, but even the culture itself. I remember coming in first week or two, and there was a guy who was in my role who was transitioning out. He and I had about a 2 or 3 month overlap, and I was asking him like, "What, tell me about the culture at Willow right now." And he said, "What culture?" He said, "We have so many subcultures here. We don't really have a culture."
Yeah, which one?
And so that was like a new thing for me. Of like part of that's the size of the organization. We have multiple locations. It's part of it's just the autonomy that was intentional. That a lot of autonomy that was intentional. So there were these kind of intentional silos that had been built with subcultures within. And so some people deeply, deeply hurt. Some teams or subcultures deeply, deeply like wounded and hurting and just so broken they couldn't even run the race. Others that were like, let's get on with this. What are we waiting for? We just need vision. Someone tell us which way we're going. Wow. Some teams that had lots of negativity and some teams that were highly positive, like, goodness, we need to pattern our other teams after them. And I told someone, it may have been with our email a month or two ago, I just said, I think we've slowed negative momentum. And I told someone last week, maybe it's even stopped largely. But that flywheel is not turning yet. We're a year into it, and it feels like we're probably a year or two away from like feeling like, oh my goodness, the momentum's now on our side. Because right now, everything we have to work really hard to get the little wins. But now we have a team that we focused the first year on just building the leadership team and right sizing the organization and kind of restructuring around a new vision. And we're deep into that now, and that's starting to pay off. We're starting to see we got leaders now that are pulling that weight with us.
I love that. You talked about a different set of tools to lead an organization that has history that's different than a skill set that leads that upstart, from the ground, new organization. So one thing I love to talk about on the show with guests is just their comfort level and their relationship with failure. So you led organizations, like you said, from the movie theater to one of the most influential and impactful largest churches in the country in about 20 years. You were with a student organization out of high school that you got on the ground floor. Where did you find failure as a good teacher in both of those long-term roles? And then maybe with the Vanderbloemen organization, what did failure teach you in those moments that helped maybe shape you to prepare you for the different tools you're using now at Willow?
Yeah, so maybe part A of that question, I would say like with the startup, there's rapid growth. It tends to be rapid growth. I mean, because if you have 50 people, it's not hard to double to 100, and then you have 100% growth. 5,000 to 10,000 is a lot harder. And that's true with money and all the things. So I would say, and especially my 20-year run at the church in Indiana, a failure was if everything is up and to the right, and we had up and to the right growth for 18 years straight, if everything's up and to the right, you stop questioning things that you actually should be questioning. You stop paying attention to things that it's like, because the growth was slowing like this, but we'd never had a year that we hadn't grown. So we're like, well, of course we're going to come out of it. Of course we're going to come out of it. Surely we're going to come out of it. But then we're not asking our questions. And then we get to the side where it's like, I don't think we're coming out of this. And then you start to question everything and everyone. And I think a mistake we made there is we started changing too many things at once. So we didn't know what change was working and what change was working against us. And so we had about 5 years of decline. And then the last 2 years I was there, we started seeing it turn around again. And so a lot of learnings through that with our team, just on vision, on vision casting, on change management, on taking people with you, on listening better, all of those things. I think as far as now, I think, a big piece is that I'm learning. I don't know if I'm getting any awards in this area yet, but I'm learning, like digging in and listening to the stories, the legacy, the history. It's easy if you come into an organization that's having difficulties and there's this assumption, expectation that it needs a turnaround. It can be easy to just ignore everything from the past because, well, that's not working. And you're asking for a turnaround. You're inviting new people on the team to help turn this around. So the new people on the team have the best ideas. So that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's probably largely not true. The best ideas are there. I think like part of like leadership, healthy leadership is coming in and surfacing the best ideas and maybe thinking about maybe asking questions people haven't asked because you're fresh and you don't know the history, but also digging into the history. Like we're trying to find right now, what are the nuggets, the gold nuggets from 40 years of history. We don't need to reinvent. We don't need to pretend like they're our idea. We just need to like raise them to the surface and say, this has always been true about Willow, and give it some new energy, some new spotlight.
I think in any transitional leadership moment, the only thing worse than undercorrecting is overcorrecting. And there's just a balance there. And I think that's what's difficult in the season and the seat you're in is exactly what you just said, that you can come in and make these assumptions that we're in the ditch because of X, Y, and Z. So we have a new playbook and we're going to run this new playbook. Like you said, you can quickly overcorrect and fix the wrong problems. That's so wise, Tim. I love that you came up with that. You've talked a lot about learning so far. So are you a reader? And if you're a reader, what are some of like the most impactful books that are your go-tos?
So people are usually surprised by this because I've written 7 books and I'm not much of a reader.
Okay. That's
so
really,
yeah. But so not much of a sit down and read a book from beginning to end person. Okay. I should say that. Sure. I read all the time. It's more bite size. It's articles, it's PDFs, it's white papers. It's the introduction in the first few chapters of a book where I feel like I kind of got it, and then I'll skim the rest. So that tends to be my learning style. Bite-sized chunks. Podcasts, honestly, is probably more of a learning style right now than just about anything, just because of a commute.
Well, I think that's a skill set. Yeah. What you're describing is, how do I distill 300 pages and what could be, 15 or 20 hours investing in a book, where I can get the main idea, apply it to my situation in under 3 hours. So was that a skill you always had, or did you kind of develop what you needed from those situations? I
just think most books, you get it's front loaded.
Yeah, that's right.
Mine probably are too.
Well, from the inside, on the publishing side, as a writer. Yeah. So that may be a little insider track right there. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. This thought didn't cross my mind until just now. So Tony Morgan and I did the first 3 books together. He's a friend that's also helps consult with churches. And the first 3 books were all like 2 to 3 page chapters. And our shtick was it's 99 simple ways to blah, blah, blah. We had 3 different books. That probably spoke to my learning, the way that I kind of, take things in. And so, the highly academic or highly intellectual long form book, it's just not going to pull me in. But those bite-sized chunks that I can kind of take. And so I feel like in most books, you kind of get the gist in the first, the introduction, the first few chapters, and then you can kind of it's more of a reference manual after that.
Okay. So favorite podcast, where are you getting your most helpful content right now?
So I really like stories. So I probably learn as much from someone's story, whether it's a business story. So, how we built that, or how I built that, kinds of podcasts. Land of the Giants is one I've been listening to recently, which is they did a whole season on Google, a whole season on Amazon, a whole season on Facebook, just unpacking these giant organizations and kind of what got them to there, and then some of the successes and failures along the way. And then I stopped consuming cable news 10 years ago because I just got so fed up and I didn't like what it was doing to my soul. So I tend to get my news. I started listening just in the last 6 months, probably, to a podcast called Left, Center, Right, which just takes kind of big issues of the day, and they have a left, center, and right commentator that unpacks it in a civil conversation, which I appreciate.
People can do that these days.
It's amazing, I know. And long form, I like really long form interviews. So Dak Shepard has a podcast he does, Armchair or something.
Yep.
And then Mark Maron has the WTF podcast, which are long form interviews he started doing it with comedians, but then it ended up just being, politicians and actors and such. And I just I love hearing, and he has a way to get to the vulnerabilities of people in his questions, which I really appreciate, hearing kind of the stuff that they've struggled through or that they struggle with, or their search for meaning, those kinds of things. I just learn a ton from people's stories.
I love that. You've mentioned a couple times mentorship relationships in your past that have, called out leadership in you and help you pursue that leadership journey. Maybe what's some of the best advice and best conversations you've had in your leadership journey that is downstream from those mentor relationships?
That's a great question. I would probably go back to the calling out piece, the I see in you conversations.
Okay.
That's the piece that I've like. It just awakened something that initially, like, I didn't know it was there. Just even recently, the last couple of weeks, someone said something about like how I interact in meetings that I wasn't even aware of. That was like, here's what you do. You bring calmness, you bring objectivity, you reduce the emotion in the room. And so those kinds of things, like when someone calls it out of you and then you realize, okay, that's a gift that's God given that I can tap into. But the takeaway for me is, am I calling that out in others? Am I using my platform, my age, my stage in life to call that out in people and say, here's what I see in you. You really need to tap into that.
When you're in senior leadership, people look to you for direction, for clarity. When you're stuck as a leader, who do you go to? Do you have first calls when you're at, those intersections in leadership and you're not sure what to do?
Yeah. So probably two places. One would be, like leaders in similar positions outside of my context.
Okay.
So I gather with a group of executive pastors, and there's probably 60 in the group, and you just get to share things, struggles, challenges, things that worked that you can just get a little bit out of your context. And 60 is too many to like get really specific, but when it's a group of 3 or 4 or 5 people that really understand context of like the world I live in, but they're not in my world. And so when you say, man, I'm really struggling with this employee, or I'm struggling with this relationship with my boss, or whatever it is. So that'd be one circle. And so there's people I'll pick up the phone that, from around the country, relationships developed over time when I'm stuck on something. The other group would be like close friends who just know me intimately well. And they're not in Chicago because I moved here a year ago. So they're people from either Houston or Indiana that just, 20, 30, 35-year relationships where I can just like say anything and, and they know my stuff. They know my junk. They know they know me well. They love me. So I can take, critique or hard feedback from that group any time of the, because I know they love me, they have my back. So that'd be probably the second group.
Can we talk about that group just a little bit longer? That's a really special output of the relationship. That's a great product of something you've poured into it. What were some of the inputs that allowed you to build those types of relationships? I know working at a church myself, sometimes it's difficult to be vulnerable with people who are in my peer group because it's like either A, it's their church. And so if I'm processing things that are difficult, I'm processing things with them that are about the church they attend. Or if they don't go to church, I'm always a little worried that I might impact their faith journey, talking about a work or organizational dynamic. So what kind of inputs in those relationships did you have to put in to build that community and that connection so you get that output of a safe place to talk about your leadership challenges?
Yeah, I would say I didn't do that well, like in my 20s and up till maybe my mid 30s. From this standpoint, I was so protectionary of the organization that I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to say anything that was deemed negative to anyone that was in any way associated with the nonprofit or then the church that I was in. But I did that to probably my own demise because then I didn't have an outlet to process. And so then you just kind of like internalize it. And then at some point, like, it spills over. And I wasn't going to counseling at the time, so I didn't have like an outlet. So I think like developing that in a more healthy way was just having like a handful. I'm an introvert. I don't have like a big social capacity. I don't have like 1,000 best friends like my wife does, so I've got a pretty small social circle. So, but some people that were kind of in that safe social circle that also worked on the staff at the church in Indiana, but like they knew my heart. They knew like, I love this place. I love my pastor. So if something comes out sideways or negative, it's not like, man, I'm out of here. This place sucks. It's like, no, I need to process. I need a place to vent. And those became safe relationships for that. And I had similar things in Houston as well. And developing that here. So I think people knowing your heart, and it takes, for me, again, the way I'm wired, it takes me a while to sense that someone knows and trusts my heart, and for me to know and trust their heart. But I think once you have that, man, it's gold.
What people that may not work in the church or nonprofit space may not understand is that you're in a senior leadership role, executive pastor, but you have a boss, a senior pastor, and then the senior pastor has elders that he's probably responsible to. So when it comes to crafting the vision for what's next, as you guys define success for the future, how does that picture that might feel kind of low resolution right now come into high resolution? How do you put feet to what success looks like in the next season of Willow?
So I can speak to the last year. It's been all about building the team. And that's probably been that's what drives me the most. I feel like you can do anything, you can turn anything around, you can build anything if you got the right team. So part of it, last May, Dave Dummett, who's the senior pastor here, and I both started in the office May 18th. There was, at the time, 400 people on staff. There was no one else in the building because COVID. Everyone was locked down.
Wow.
But he and I couldn't work at home for various reasons, so we just worked in the office. So at that point, it's like he and I doing a lot of conversations about vision and where we're going and what needs to happen. And then you get that first person, and they come on, and then they contribute to that. And then you get that second person. And now we have an intentionally too big executive team. We have 18 people for the reason that we're building the ship, as we're floating it. And so we're trying to, so every person that we bring in, they begin to form that story. And then every person we tap into that's been around here, I met a guy not long ago, and I said, let me come to your office. And his office is there's no windows. It's in the depths of the bowels of the building. And he's been on staff for 46 years.
Holy cow.
And I'm like, good night. There's so much I can learn from you. So tapping into those and just tell me stories, tell me learnings. And, he's carrying some deep stuff, and just be able to listen to him. And so then you're just kind of pulling it together. And it's not that it's not like a democratic, we're going to all vote and whatever wins out is where we're going. There's still clear direction from Dave as the senior leader, blessed by our board of elders and directors, and some of us early people that came on early. We came on because we buy into where he wants to take the church, but then we all kind of get to contribute to it and speak into it. And the past of our organization informs it, and the people around the table inform it.
That's good. So on the show, we obviously talk about the things that no one ever tells you that prepare you for success. So what have been those surprise teachings and those surprise learnings that you had no clue on the front end in a leadership journey that have really shaped everything? So what's the most significant thing maybe now that no one ever told you on the front end?
I think this will sound so elementary, but no one ever told me.
That's good.
The importance of relationships in the journey, and the importance that the journey is part of the purpose, not just the destination. So, I grew up in a home with dad was a businessman and driven, and I was kind of surrounded by, and so I think coming out of high school and going into my first job, there was a sense of what we're going to accomplish, it's the metrics, it's the accomplishment, it's the stats, it's the facts, it's the up and to the right. And sometimes flying past those relationships, so, early on, I just, I'd stack my days. Now, I carve space because I don't know the conversation that needs to happen that day that's not planned and no one asked for, and it's not on anyone's agenda and no one scheduled it. But that's the conversation that needs to happen that day that ultimately pushes the organization forward, and the metrics, the up and the right and all that. But it's not about that. It's about that. It's about building into that relationship. That's the first thing when I think about, this today, that's the first thing that came to mind.
That's really helpful. That resonates with me deeply because I'm a destinations guy. What's the fastest way from point A to point B? Because I want to get to point B. So the reminder that like, hey, how you get there matters, and who you get there with maybe matters just as much. So that's great. Thanks for that. You got a second one though.
Yeah, I think another one is that's become kind of a mantra for me is assume the best. I think we live in such a critical, cynical world where and especially now with the whole cancel culture, where we instantly ascribe motive to someone based on one phrase that they said or one action or one behavior. And so I've tried to program myself over time, especially probably the last 10 or 20 years, of just like, whatever happens, let's assume the best. That can't be what they meant. That can't be, I was in a meeting yesterday and I just had to say it, like, we got to assume the best, because, there was a conversation of like, yeah, it's got to be deeper than that. There's got to be like, there's some kind of suspicious reason for why that happened. Like, let's just believe the best and seek to understand. Let's go into the conversation and seek to understand. And to me, that's, that like changes everything about how you lead and how you approach. And honestly, it bites you in the back every now and then. I had a situation last year where I was kind of believing the best and believing the best and believing the best, and found out that the best was not happening. There was a lot of covert under the hood things happening, coalitions being built, money being stolen, stuff like that.
Oh gosh.
But to me, like, and I've been through those a few different times where it's like I assumed the best and I was wrong. But to me, like, I still say, like, go into every situation and assume the best, because the outcome of that more often than not is going to be a positive thing. And every now and then you're going to be like, oh, shoot, that I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
And people might say, you're naive or your head's in the sand or whatever, but I still just choose to like go into it assuming their motive is not what you think it was. Their motive was not a bad thing, that they meant the best, and then seek to understand.
That's great. It's a risk reward calculation. You're willing to risk being wrong because the probability you're right about assuming the best is more than likely the best, most gracious story. I love that. That's really good. If you're sitting across the table from Tim, maybe back in the first job, and you've got these next, 35 or 40 years in leadership, would you want him to be surprised by all the turns and corners in the leadership journey, or would you want to give him some advice on the front end? And what would it be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the first thing that pops into my mind, I remember because since I kind of started in my career, like when I just turned 18, like a week before, and then into my 20s, I remember, I'd be around Enneagram 8s and drivers, and they'd be like always like trying to the next best thing and improve and change and overhaul and transition. And I'd be like, aren't we ever going to like just arrive? And I think I would have told myself, nope. And that's okay. Like it's always going to be, the world's changing every day you wake up. The world is different than it was when you went to bed. So there's always something that's changing. And so it's that driven thing. It's not about the destination. Like, we'll be able to get there and they're going to be able to check the box and we'll be able to celebrate. And that does happen in little projects and little ways and little seasons. But I've grown comfortable in the fact that we're in an ever changing world, and that's great. And there's something I don't know that I need to figure out today that I didn't know that wouldn't have helped me yesterday because the world's a different place today. And like lean into that. That's part of it. That's part of the excitement and the challenge and the journey. That's probably a little intangible, but that's kind of what pops into my brain.
No, I read this book when I first got into this job at CrossPoint, and the chapter was, "You can never spike the football." I think you wrote that chapter, and that's so.
Oh, did I? I was gonna say.
Yeah, you did.
That sounds like a great phrase.
Yeah, it's difficult. You always want to celebrate moments and milestones, but so often than not, it's not where you're ultimately trying to get. So you got to keep moving down the road. That's good. I love that. Well, Tim, I just want to say I applaud the monumental effort you guys are taking on in Chicago, and I know that you guys have what it takes to get that to the next chapter. And so thank you for jumping in and putting your gifts and your talents towards a complicated problem. I think that's awesome, and we're proud of you guys.
Well, man, appreciate your encouragement. I think the key is the team. We've got the right team, and so I think promising days are ahead.
Man, I salute any leader that takes on a role that they know is an uphill challenge. What Tim signed on for at Willow Creek is an awesome responsibility, and I know that team is going to do an amazing job in a new chapter of a hugely influential church. I had two main aha moments in this conversation. I loved when Tim talked about his 18 years of up until the right growth and how success can be deceptive and cause you not to pause and ask great questions along the way. Leaders shouldn't only look under the hood when things break down and need maintenance. We have to constantly evaluate whether or not our culture and our systems and our teams are healthy and ready for new seasons of growth and can maintain the pace that we set. Second one, Tim also talked about his mantra of assume the best. This one really hit me like a sucker punch. As he described it, he talked about being willing to be wrong and suffer the consequences of this value. But he also said it's worth the risk. So many times I let my cynicism drive and I end up assuming the worst. Initially that feels safe and like it protects me from any fallout, but it's really a gift for anyone to work for a leader who understands that to lead well, we not only have to call out the best in our people, but back that up by assuming the best in them as well. Well, that's it for today. I hope this podcast was helpful. And if it is, please take a minute just to rate and subscribe. But more importantly, I'd be really grateful if you shared it with someone that you think needs to hear it. Well, as always, thanks for listening, and make sure you join us next time on the No One Ever Told Me podcast.